Good evening. My name is Grace Engel, and I will begin this evening by reading Loyola's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Loyola University Chicago community acknowledges its location on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. We recognize the tragic legacy of colonization and genocide that still impacts Native American lives today. As a Jesuit university, we recognize our responsibility to understand, teach, and respect the past and present realities of local Native Americans and their continued connection to this land. Now please join me in welcoming Kirsten Hedegaard, Assistant Professor and Director of Choral and Vocal Activities, to the podium to introduce a special musical performance.
We are so honored to be here this evening, and this conference marks the 10th climate conference at which a Loyola choir has performed, thanks to Nancy Tuckman. Tonight, our Loyola Chamber Choir, Ignatian Voices, is delighted to be here, not necessarily to perform for you this year, but to sing with you. To complement the highly complex Misa Laudato Si that we are premiering on Saturday, we have also been exploring community singing models this semester, including new accessible songs that seek to mobilize communities around climate change. One of the first songs to be created for the Eco Voice songbook, Luke Wallace's Easy on the Earth, has a simple refrain alternating with several verses. We invite you to sing along with us each time the refrain returns, and to practice, we'll sing the refrain a few additional times at the beginning so you can get the hang of it. We expect to hear all of you singing loudly with us. Sopranos will get us going.
Get your kids to the garden, from the garden they'll grow, and they'll learn to go easy, they'll learn to live slow. Get your kids to the garden, from the garden they'll grow, and they'll learn to go easy, yeah. Easy on the earth, lightly on the water, remember this place is for your sons and daughters. Easy on the earth, lightly on the water, remember who this place is for. Get your kids to a river, with the river they'll flow. It'll teach them how to paddle, it'll teach them how to row. Get your kids to a river, with the river they'll flow. It'll take them where they need to go. I'm going easy, easy. I'm going easy, yeah. I'm going
see their reflections wherever they go. In the rain, water, flood, water, sleet, hail, snow, let them see their reflections wherever they go.
Thank you, Grace Engel, for reciting the Loyola University Land Acknowledgement Statement, and to Kirsten Hedegaard and your beautiful Ignatian voices that always get me totally choked up. That was a lovely choral performance, and it serves to open our 2025 Climate Change Conference on a high note, no pun intended. Good evening, and welcome everybody to Loyola University Chicago's 10th Annual Climate Change Conference. My name is Nancy Tuckman. I'm the founding dean of the School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University Chicago. It's my distinct honor to serve as the MC for tonight's event. This conference is designed to raise awareness and call people to action on the climate crisis and its many ramifications to humans and to nature. This year's theme is water security and the emerging water crisis. We have hosted themes around climate-induced food insecurity, climate refugees, the climate crisis and human health, and accompanying youth to a hope-filled future, for some examples. This week, we will provide perspectives from expert scientists, social scientists, policymakers, journalists, community activists, indigenous anthropologists, and businesses on how the changing climate is causing water security issues globally and locally, and what we are doing and can do to mitigate the threats. Before introducing our esteemed keynote speaker, I'd like to build a little Loyola pride around Loyola's recent accomplishment of achieving climate neutrality. What does climate neutrality mean? Okay, I'm in a crowd that knows how important that is. That's terrific. Oftentimes I have to kind of explain what it means. Well, basically, I will tell you that it means that we take as many molecules of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere as we do put into the atmosphere through the regular operations of our primary campuses here in Chicago. And that's what makes us net zero. It gives us a net zero carbon balance for the university. But this is really no small feat. It required 22 years of renovating our buildings to make them energy efficient, the installation of 3 geothermal heating and cooling systems, a state-of-the-art heating and chilling plant, and the purchase of 100% of our electricity coming from the largest solar farm that's on the east side of the Mississippi River. So today we operate our campuses using only 15% of the total fossil fuels that we were using prior to 2008. And it's actually bigger than that because we've increased the number of faculty and students on our campuses and increased the number of buildings on our campuses since 2008 as well. And currently, we pay carbon offsets for the last 15% of fossil fuels that we continue to consume. And our local B Corp partner, Tradewater, works to prevent the most potent greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere. And Loyola pays them to do this important work. And that's how we offset the last 15% of our own greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, Tradewater is one of the sponsors of this event. And thanks to their donated carbon credits, the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to transportation, air travel, and refreshments have made this conference a climate neutral event. Thank you, Tradewater. I'm now delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Gleick. Dr. Gleick is a leading scientist trained at the intersection of hydrology, climatology, and policy. He co-founded an independent research think tank called the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California in 1987, which advances solutions to the world's most pressing water challenges. Dr. Gleick is author of dozens of scientific papers and 14 books, including the influential 3-part series, The World's Water, Bottled and Sold, The Story Behind Our Obsession with Bottled Water, which is ridiculous, and a 21st Century U.S. Water Policy. His most recent book, The 3 Ages of Water, Prehistoric Past, Imperiled Present, and a Hope for the Future, was published in 2023. Tonight, Dr. Gleick will set the stage for the rest of the Climate Change Conference by describing the current state of water and water scarcity on our planet, while showing the way to a hopeful future. If audience participants have any questions that you would like to pose to Dr. Gleick after his remarks, we'll have a question and answer period. Please write your questions on the index cards that you received at the registration desk, and we will be collecting them at the end of the keynote address. And now, please help me in welcoming world-renowned water expert, Dr. Peter Gleick.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. This is really great. And before I start, I have a lot to say tonight. I wanted to thank the land acknowledgement. I'm delighted that we're doing land acknowledgements now. It's an important thing. And I appreciate the chorus as well. I'm a singer. I always love to hear a choral group. And that was a wonderful, I'm a bass also, but that bass has got a great future in singing. And I especially wanted to thank Dean Tuckman and the staff of the School for Environmental Sustainability for inviting me here tonight. I had a chance to look around a little bit. I got a little bit of the sustainability tour. The school and the university as a whole are doing really remarkable things. The idea that the school as a whole, the university as a whole is carbon neutral is really remarkable. There are a lot of places around this country that aren't doing that at all, or trying to do that, or achieving that, and that's a great accomplishment. And I'm just honored. I'm honored to be here. So I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about climate change and water resources. And then, because I couldn't help myself, I added a section toward the end of my talk about the idea of scientific integrity and some of the challenges that we're facing today. So a little bit of an outline for what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the importance of water. I'm going to talk about a little bit of a primer on climate change, which my guess is most of you don't need, but some of you might. And so I'm going to to talk about what we know about climate change and why we know it and how we know it. I'm going to talk about the impacts of climate change on society and ecosystems. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on water resources, which of course is the theme of this conference. A little bit about what we can do about climate change, and in particular, the problem of water poverty, which is a challenge that we face. And then finally, some thoughts, as I mentioned, about the importance and integrity of science. My key messages, first of all, for many years, scientists have been warning about the growing threat of human-caused climate change. Risks to ecosystems, to infrastructure, to human health, and particularly, from my perspective, and for the perspective of this conference, to water resources. We know that the hydrologic cycle is at the heart of the climate system. The hydrologic cycle is the climate system in many ways. And we know that as we change the climate, we will fundamentally change evaporation, we'll change precipitation patterns and runoff, the severity of extreme events, including floods and droughts, and the human demands for water. These changes are no longer theoretical. They're no longer predictions. These are now a reality, and that's something that we have to acknowledge and accept and deal with. So water is connected to everything, and the truth is climate is connected to everything. It's connected to infrastructure, to public health, to forests and forest fires, to agriculture, to ecosystems and the environment, to energy. All of those things are water issues. All of those things are climate issues. And water is also interdisciplinary, and this is one of the things that I love about water. I've been working on water for a long time, and I'm trained as a scientist and a climate scientist and a hydrologist, but water is an engineering issue, it's a public policy issue, it's an economics issue, it's a legal issue, it's a planning issue. It connects to anything, and so I don't care what field you're in. There's something about water that is related to what you're doing, and there's something about climate that is related to what you're doing. So a quick primer on climate change. Again, this is maybe 101 for most of you, but I'll go through some of it anyway. A summary, quickly. Climate science has established beyond any reasonable doubt that humans are now influencing the global climate. The cause is emissions of heat-trapping gases from fossil fuel combustion and from changes in land use. These changes are already affecting human health and property and economics and ecosystems, and the changes and the impacts of climate change will only get worse in the future, no matter what action we take. But having said that, the future consequences of climate change will be much smaller if we act now to take actions to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, the idea of being carbon neutral. But both mitigation, that is the reduction of emissions, and adaptation to impacts we can no longer avoid are going to be required. And I'm going to talk about mitigation and adaptation in a little more detail. So, climate versus weather. Sometimes there's a little bit of a confusion about the difference between climate and weather. Weather are short-term changes in the atmosphere. We had a wonderful weather day today. It was gorgeous today. Climate is what the weather is like over long periods of time in a particular area. And an easy way to think about this is climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. But another way to think about it is that climate determines what clothes you put on weather determines what clothes you put on every day. Climate determines what clothes you have in the closet. You live in Chicago, I live in Berkeley, California. What you have in your closet is a little different than what I have in my closet. But every day I look at the weather and that determines what I put on that day. So a little bit of a distinction between climate and weather. And it's important because we have conversations about weather models and we have conversations about climate models, and they're not the same thing, but understanding that distinction is important. So what causes climate change? First of all, climate has changed throughout the history of the planet. Human-caused climate change is a new thing, but climate change is not a new thing. Climate has changed over literally the billions of years we've had that the Earth has existed, and it's been caused by a lot of different things. Climate change is caused by literally changes in the orbit of the Earth, or the tilt of the Earth, which changes on a 10,000 or 100,000 year period. These are called, for those of you who really care, Milankovitch cycles, after the Russian scientist Milankovitch who discovered them. And over millennia, they can change and have changed the climate of the planet. Changes in solar output affects the climate. Changes in clouds affect the climate. Changes in ice sheets, differences between ice ages and interglacial periods affect the climate and the weather. Changes in volcanic eruptions, big volcanic eruptions that change the atmospheric composition affect the climate. Changes ultimately in gases in the atmosphere, which is sort of us at the moment, affect climate. And internal dynamics of the way the oceans and the atmosphere interact have an effect. And some of these changes are big, and some of these changes are small. Some of them are slow, some of them are fast, some of them persist for literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and some of them happen and then fade quickly, such as volcanic eruptions that may cool the planet for a year or two, and then those particles disappear and the climate goes back. So lots of things change the climate. But greenhouse gases is what we're worrying about now. Some greenhouse gases exist in the atmosphere naturally, and that's a good thing, because if we had no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at all, naturally, the Earth would be a frozen ball. Greenhouse gases, as you might guess from their name, keep the Earth warm. Some are added by human activities. And the greenhouse gases I'm talking about are water vapor and certain nitrogen oxides, and carbon dioxide and methane, and artificial chlorofluorocarbons. These are all greenhouse gases that help trap heat in the atmosphere. When humans burn fossil fuels or wood, or when we sometimes change land use patterns, we affect greenhouse gases. We emit certain kinds of greenhouse gases. We change the ability of natural ecosystems to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And that's the problem today. We're altering the composition of the atmosphere. We're increasing greenhouse gas compositions. So what do we know about past climates and historical climates? Why do we know that the climate is changing today? There are a lot of different techniques. This is called paleoclimatology, study of ancient climates. We look at ice cores. We take ice cores and we can actually measure the atmospheric concentration in ancient ice to tell you what the composition of the atmosphere was in ancient times. Fossil pollen, which tells us about vegetation in ancient times. Different kinds of isotopes, tree rings that'll tell you. Fat rings suggest we have had wet years. Thin rings on trees tell you have dry years, and we have tree ring records going back thousands of years now. Sediment cores, there are many, many ways that we look at paleoclimatic records. But let me show one graph. This is actually one of my favorite graphs. This is a graph of atmospheric carbon dioxide going back 800,000 years. On the left side of on the x-axis here, left side of the graph is 800,000 years ago. All the way to the right is present day. The up and down is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as determined from ice cores from Antarctica. And the y-axis is parts per million. And so you can see that over the last 800,000 years, we've had periods of time where the CO2 in the atmosphere was maybe 250, maybe not quite 300 parts per million. That was during interglacials when the Earth was warm. It was low, around 150 to 200 parts per million. When it was low, we had ice ages. And so these are natural changes in climate. Low CO2, cold. Higher CO2, warm. And that's one of the ways we understand how climate has changed over time. But here we are today. This big red arrow on the very right side is the increase in carbon dioxide literally since the Industrial Revolution, over the last 150 years or so. And I circled at the very top, today's concentration of carbon dioxide, literally today's concentration of carbon dioxide, is around 430 parts per million. And I put this on, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I was born at 314 parts per million. You can look it up. This massive increase in CO2 is human-caused climate change. This is the emissions, this is the burning of fossil fuels and the changes in land use that has fundamentally driven atmospheric CO2 concentrations higher than it's been actually for about 5 million years. This is human-caused climate change. And we know the cause. This is emissions of CO2 from burning of fossil fuels. You can see it, it's a little hard to read, but coal in blue and oil and natural gas over the last 150 years of the Industrial Revolution. This massive emission of CO2 has raised the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere because it's happened faster than nature has the ability to take it out of the atmosphere. That's the imbalance. And we also know the consequences. And we know the consequences because we've seen paleoclimate records that say higher CO2, warmer, cold, low CO2, colder. And we have climate models now, sophisticated models that also tell us what to expect. And this is the observed increases in global atmospheric temperature from 1850 to now. You've probably all seen these rising curves of temperature. This is, again, the fingerprint of human-caused climate change. None of these facts are in legitimate dispute, which I have to say is not the same as in dispute. They're not in legitimate dispute. Every National Academy of Sciences on the planet agrees with that. Every scientific organization agrees with that. There's plenty of science that remains to be done about the rates of change, about the sensitivity of the atmosphere to greenhouse gases, about the details of future impacts, about effectiveness of response strategies. I'm not saying that science there's no science to be done. There's a tremendous amount of science to be done. But the fundamental science about human-caused climate change is not in dispute. The reality is clear, it's definitive, and it's unambiguous. So, the impacts of climate change. Climate change is connected to everything we care about, and so the impacts of climate change will affect everything that we care about. Melting of ice on land, glaciers are disappearing. Melting of ice in Antarctica on land, melting of ice in Greenland. Fire frequency and intensity, storm frequency and intensity, droughts and floods, impacts on the oceans. The oceans are acidifying. They're absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's making them more acidic. That has impacts on coral reefs, as does rising ocean temperatures. Impacts on agriculture, important water component of this puzzle. So we're already beginning to see a lot of these impacts, and more are coming. And indicators of a warming world are many. Higher temperatures, changes in the humidity patterns as temperatures go up, more evaporation in the atmosphere, glaciers are disappearing, temperatures are growing over land and also in the oceans themselves. Tree lines are shifting, birds are migrating, butterflies are migrating at different times of year, and now they're not finding the vegetation that they evolved to find. Sea level is going up as warmer oceans expand and as ice melts and contributes to ocean volume. And so on. There are lots of impacts of climate change. But I want to focus specifically on water. We know that climate change is already affecting water resources. And I added this quote, which I don't know if you can read at the bottom, but I'll read it out loud. The evidence that humans are changing the water cycle of the United States is increasingly compelling. And that's a quote from the first U.S. National Climate Assessment in 2000. And I was one of the authors of the water sector of that report. That was, what year is this? That was a quarter of a century ago. So the fact that humans are changing the hydrologic cycle of the planet isn't a new scientific conclusion. It's a long understood reality. And panel one tomorrow, I know of the conference, is going to talk about global perspectives on this. and I encourage people to look at that. And there are lots of pieces to this puzzle about climate and water. Again, we know air temperatures are going up. As temperatures go up, more water evaporates. Crops demand more water. People demand more water. More water in the atmosphere means more humidity. More water in the atmosphere actually means more rainfall, although not necessarily where we want it or when we want it. We know that total precipitation is likely to both increase and decrease in different parts of the planet. And unfortunately, the bad news is it looks like what's going to happen is wet areas are going to get wetter and dry areas are going to get drier, which is sort of the opposite of what we would like if we had a choice about what we were doing in changing the climate. We know that more of the precipitation is going to fall as rain rather than snow, and we already see this. The amount of snow the US is getting is a lot less than it got 20 years ago. Snow is disappearing, and what does fall as snow melts earlier and changes runoff patterns in rivers and streams, and we're seeing this in my state of California, where a lot more runoff is happening now in winters. When we used to get snow in the mountains, we're now getting runoff, and the risk of flooding has increased, and the way we operate our reservoirs has become much more complicated. And so reservoir operation or water system operations is going to be affected by all of this. Sea level rise, I mentioned, is already going up. It's going up again for two reasons. Warm water takes up more space than cold water. It's called thermal expansion, and any land ice that melts contributes to a greater volume of the oceans. And as sea levels go up, coastal areas flood, and that's a damaging problem for property. It's a damaging problem from storms. We're already seeing that, but it also affects coastal aquatic ecosystems. It also affects coastal groundwater systems that are getting more saltwater intrusion, and so that's a freshwater saltwater problem as well. And panel 2 tomorrow is going to address a lot of these issues. So perhaps most concerning is this issue of extreme weather. As you all know, extremes are really what kill us. We don't worry so much about average rainfall. We worry about droughts, and we worry about floods. And we're already seeing an increase in extreme flooding and extreme droughts. Both ends of the spectrum are becoming worse. We also know already that hurricanes are becoming more severe, not necessarily more frequent at the moment, but more severe because of global warming. Higher sea surface temperatures contributes to the energy of storms, and hurricane intensity has grown in the last couple of decades. And that, of course, affects a lot of things that we already care about. So natural catastrophes are on the rise. This is a graph from Swiss Re, which is a reinsurance company. And just to step back for a second, the insurance companies understand this. Their job is risk. And so they track these kinds of things very carefully. This is a graph that shows extremes of hydrologic events and climatological events and meteorological events, showing overall an increase in the number of extreme events over time. And their conclusion, quote, "The only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change." They can't afford to deny the reality of climate change. This is another interesting graph. It's a graph from data from what's called the GRACE satellite, which is actually a pair of satellites that measure gravity around the world. And by doing that, they actually measure the presence or absence or changes in the presence or absence of water resources. The red area are places over time that are losing water. The blue areas are places over time that are gaining water. And just to highlight a couple of them, if you look at the Arctic, and if you look at Greenland and the Antarctic, it's red. They're losing ice. They lose mass, gravity changes, and this satellite detects those changes. The western United States, parts of India where overdraft of groundwater has led to massive removal of water and loss of water. These satellites also give us evidence that climate is affecting water resources. And there's just a tremendous amount of evidence here about climate and water and climate and other impacts. If you're interested in climate assessments, there are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. There are the national climate assessments, of which there are now, I want to say 4. although the most recent, it's required by law for the federal government to do these every few years. Trump has just canceled is trying to cancel the next one. But there's plenty of information if you want to follow up. So what can we do? We have three choices. We can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, we can adapt to climate changes, or we can suffer. And the question is, what proportion are we going to choose? So let me talk about each of these. We can mitigate emissions, that is, cut the emissions of greenhouse gases and reduce the rate at which we change the climate. And there are lots of ways of doing that. Change energy systems, so we're burning fewer fossil fuels and we're producing energy with non-carbon sources, such as solar panels. Electric cars get fossil fuels out of our transportation system, wind systems. Energy efficiency, that's a picture of figuring out where losses are in houses. You can reduce energy demand by cutting losses. We can change diets, a very important factor in terms of both water use and land use and energy use. We can change our diets. Diets are related to emissions. We can change land use policies and so on. There are lots of things we can do to reduce emissions. I won't go into more detail. How to do that is a policy question. And I'm a scientist. I'm not going to offer my opinions about policy options, but there are lots of options. There are economic strategies. We could put a price on carbon. There are market strategies. We could have cap and trade systems that permit us to trade carbon from one place to another. There's energy policy. We can invest a lot more in non-fossil energy sources. There's regulatory strategies. We can put a limit on emissions. We have a limit on all sorts of pollutants. Carbon is a pollutant. We could have regulatory strategies as well. We could have global agreements. There are individual actions. We could have global agreements like the Paris Accord, like the Loss and Damage Fund, which provides international support for countries hit by climate disasters. We could have there's something called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is an international fund that helps developing countries transition away from coal. The Paris Agreement, the Loss and Damage Fund, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Until about a week ago, the US was partners in all three, and we have now just withdrawn from all three of those global agreements. So the cost of acting is far less than the cost of failing to act. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. I'm going to show a bunch of cartoons. But this is my favorite cartoon. It's one dinosaur showing set to another dinosaur an idea for an asteroid mitigation program. And you can see the asteroid coming up in the top left, top right. And the other dinosaur is saying, well, that looks like it will cost a fortune. The reality is climate inaction will cost a fortune. And there's a new report out today about the cost of climate inaction. And the estimate is that if we do nothing about climate, it's going to cost a third of global GDP in this century, which is an unimaginable economic impact. But the other part of the report out today is that if we invest 2% of our global GDP, we can avoid 90% of that cost. The cost of acting is far less than the cost of failing to act. But mitigation is not enough. Some climate impacts can no longer be avoided because we haven't mitigated soon enough. We've put this off for a long time, and the climate is now changing. And there are a wide range of climate impacts. Changes in sea level I've talked about, impacts on agriculture, impacts on water resources, I've given you some sense of that, impacts on fire frequency, and so on. There are a lot of impacts that are coming. In fact, many are already here. And the third panel tomorrow that you should go to is on local solutions to that. And so what can we do to adapt water resources to climate change? We can build resilience into our water systems. That is the ability, and I define resilience, the ability of water systems to function so that nature and people, including those on the front lines and disproportionately impacted, thrive under shocks, stresses, and change. Make our systems resilient. That's one idea. We can prevent impacts by limiting development, for example, in flood-prone areas. We build in floodplains. Let's maybe stop doing that. That would prevent some of the impacts that are coming from flooding. We can prepare. We can develop early warning systems or emergency planning or education programs, water storage and efficiency programs. We can choose drought-tolerant plants for agriculture or low water-using plants to cut water demands for agriculture. We can respond, evacuate flooded areas that are vulnerable to flooding. We can establish water facilities outside of vulnerable areas. We can move assets out of flood zones. And recover is the fourth category. We have insurance programs. We can rebuild, maybe not necessarily in the same areas that are vulnerable, and restore services. I'd like to talk a little bit about the particular problem of water poverty. And by that I mean, I work on water issues in general. There are a lot of different crises associated with water, but in my opinion, the most severe challenge we face is the failure to provide safe water and sanitation for everyone on the planet. There are billions of people today that don't have access to safe water and sanitation, something I call water poverty. All individuals and communities should have access to safe, clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, what we call WASH. All communities and individuals ought to be resilient in the face of floods and droughts and other climate risks, should be able to directly participate in water management, share in the economic, social, and environmental benefits of water systems, and not be disproportionately affected by adverse economic, social, and environmental impacts of climate change. And as I say, we have massive current water inequities. The failure to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone, disproportionate impacts based on race or on economic status, and disproportionate exposure to climate risks. Not all of us are equally vulnerable to the risks of climate change that are coming. And I wanted to talk briefly about the Laudato Si. I simply just want to say, again, there's a Saturday event associated with the Laudato Si. And of course, I know we're all thinking about the health of the Pope. Among the things that the Laudato Si said about climate and water and equity, my favorite three topics, are first, quote, climate change is a global problem with grave implications. Again, this is the 10th year anniversary. None of this is new. Inequity affects not only individuals, but entire countries. The exploitation of the planet has already exceeded acceptable limits, and we have still not solved the problem of poverty. One particularly serious problem is the quality of water available to the poor. Every day, unsafe water results in many deaths and the spread of water-related diseases. And finally, quote, our world has a grave social debt toward the poor who lack access to drinking water because they are denied the right to life consistent with their inalienable dignity. So, the Laudato Si. If I have a few more minutes, I want to talk a little bit about challenges to the integrity of science, and I'll try and keep this shorter than I would like. The strength of US science is central to the strength of our economy, our health, our well-being, and our society. Attacks on science and scientists and funding and research priorities and activities are rapidly increasing today through the abuse of the scientific process, public uncertainty and skepticism, and sometimes ignorance, censorship of language. And we must all become better at seeing through the tools used by anti-science forces, including logical fallacies and lies and inappropriate manipulation of fact and social media abuses. And I would note that just yesterday, the Trump's EPA announced its intention to eliminate 31 fundamental environmental regulations, including the endangerment finding that climate change endangers public health and ecosystem health. Emission limits on fossil fuel power plants, these are to be eliminated, including emission limits from trucks and cars, protections from mercury pollution, protections for clean water, environmental justice programs, and many more. I'm not going to talk about this, but there are lots of logical fallacies, and I urge you to look up logical fallacies like arguments from ignorance, arguments from error, arguments from misinterpretation, arguments from ideology, I am going to talk a little more about, or the manipulation of science to align with ideology, from personal belief or personal incredulity, the inability to believe something because of the way you were raised or what you believe, tradition, arguments from consensus. There are lots of what are called logical fallacies, and some of them are really interesting, but the more all of us understand about what they are, the better equipped we'll be to see through them. And again, there are many more. But about arguments from ideology, this is again one of my favorite cartoons. This is a scientist looking, or a guy looking through a microscope, and the scientist is standing behind him, and he's saying, darn, you're right, they've all been contaminated by politics. And arguments from ideology are very common. They're rooted often in religion or political identity. There are lots of causes, and they go way back. Galileo versus the church was an argument from ideology. Lysenkoism, which crippled Soviet science in the 1930s for decades. Creationism, intelligent design, is an argument from religion. Climate denial is an argument from ideology as well, often, although it falls under lots of categories. But again, I changed my talk like 500 times before I came. This was from last night. This is a headline from the New York Times. The EPA this is the EPA head, the new administrator of the EPA, has said his agency's mission was to make buying cars, heating homes, and running businesses cheaper, not to protect the environment. And I have to point out, the name of his agency is the Environmental Protection Agency. What's the mission? So this is one of the challenges that we're facing today. And there are lots of other types of abuses of science, which I'm not going to go into because they're too depressing. And I'm running out of time. Oh, one more, though. Manipulation of the scientific process and manipulation of funding and bullying of scientists. And here, I'm going to have to read this up on the screen. This is a quote from J.D. Vance in 2021. Quote, "We have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. The professors are the enemy. And lest you think that was just rhetoric and hyperbole, look for the video of him saying that. It's pretty clear how strongly he believes that, and the actions today support that, unfortunately. Censorship of language. I thought about giving a talk about climate change, but never saying the word climate change, because the federal government's censoring the words climate change, but I thought that would be too cute. False balance in the media. I'm going to talk about this one for a second. Again, one of my cartoons. This is a talk show host in the middle. We'll be talking to Dr. Jenkins of the National Institute of Health about the results of his 3-year study. And then for a different take, we'll talk to Roger here, who I understand has reached the opposite conclusion just by sitting on his couch and speculating. And so this is this question about media balance. One person says, the media might report one person saying it's raining, and somebody else who says it's not raining, when really maybe the job of the media is to look outside the window and not put on the guy who says it's not raining if it's raining. And this issue of false balance is a serious problem today in the media, especially around climate change and around water issues. And another cartoon, again, in the climate debate, the facts are on one side, and there really is only one side. Sorry. Finally, science works. I love political cartoons. I have hundreds of them in my files. This one actually sometimes brings me to tears. Sorry. So it's a mother talking to her daughter, and the daughter says, "What's that mark on your arm, Mama?" "It's my smallpox vaccine scar." "Why don't I have one?" "Because it worked." Science works, and that's one of the messages I'd like to leave you with. So moving forward, identify and resist attempts to misuse science. Understand and recognize logical fallacies and abuses of science. Defend and support science. Reject censorship. Be skeptical of those that produce results inconsistent with well-understood science. Look for ideological influence. But I would note, sometimes well-understood science is wrong. That's what science does. We correct ourselves when the facts tell us to. But look for that ideological influence. Find experts. Don't seek false balance. Understand and recognize the flaws of social media and its ability to spread bad science. Separate out science from politics, but understand they're related in important ways. Without good science, you cannot have good politics. And because climate and water are both such massive topics and so intertwined with everything we care about, there's plenty of science still to be done, and there's always room for new voices, insights, and stories. So in sum, water is vital for everything we do. Climate change is real. It's happening. It's us. Our water resources are especially vulnerable to climate change. We must work to reduce the severity of climate change and adapt to those impacts we can no longer avoid. Protecting the integrity and strength of U.S. science is critical for our own well-being, for the well-being of our society, and for our health. And for those able and willing to speak up, we have a responsibility to do so, because not everyone can. We need science, not silence. Thank you very much. So I've been asked to ask you to send your questions to the people collecting them.
Mark, are you going to collect them? So our staff who are in the back of the room will be collecting questions. If you need a card to write a question on, please raise your hand, and they'll bring you a card. We've got somebody over here. And I'm also looking for some questions from online. In the meantime, I have a question to start us out. What would you say we have a lot of undergraduate students here who are preparing for careers, some in the sciences, some in environmental fields. Any advice that you have for them about how to prepare to be advocates for action on climate and quality science in the future?
Wow, okay. That's a very personal kind of a question. We're all different. We all have different skills and interests and abilities and communities. So I don't have any single answer to that. I was trained as a scientist. I never really was trained in communication, although it's become I'm fond of that now. And not all scientists have the ability or the willingness to communicate, but that's an option. We all can be involved in our communities, and now, especially more than ever, communities are critically important at all levels, from your family to neighborhoods to religion to whatever. You can get involved in politics. I often tell people, run for water boards, run for local school boards, become involved that way. We need much more grassroots politics. Or do good science, or do good, whatever you're interested in. There's just no one answer to that.
Okay, Dr. Gleick, we have a question from the audience. Only around 15 years ago, we had organizations like Republicans for the Environment from a standpoint of scientific integrity. Why did climate change become a partisan issue, do you think?
Yeah, so climate change has been a partisan issue for a long time. Again, all of this is, I should have made this clear at the beginning, all of this is my personal opinion. The simplest answer to that is that the emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are fundamentally tied to one sector of our economy, the combustion of fossil fuels. And the economic strength of the fossil fuel industry and the health of the fossil fuel industry is fundamentally dependent on not cutting emissions of fossil fuels. And maybe that's too simplistic, but I think that's driven a lot of this. And in fact, a lot of the evidence now for funding of those who deny the reality of climate change has pretty clearly come from the fossil fuel industry. It's very clearly come from the fossil fuel industry. Even though, again, there's plenty of very strong evidence that the fossil fuel industry knew 50 years ago that emissions of greenhouse gases would change the climate. That evidence has been presented in court. It's pretty clear from documents that have been released. I think that's what's driven the politics of this. And that continues to be the challenge.
I have another question from the web, if we want to do that. We have Heidi asks, the holidays have become synonymous with sitting at the dinner table with an environment teeming with political tension. What's your go-to response when people in your network deny climate change's existence?
Could you ask that again?
Oh, so when you're dealing with people, perhaps in family, who don't believe in climate change, do you have a go-to response for talking with those people?
I don't. So there's a good colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Catherine Hayhoe, she's actually an evangelical climate scientist down in Texas. She's Canadian, but she's teaching down in Texas. Actually has a good answer to that. So Google Catherine Hayhoe and how to speak to your relatives about climate denial. She has great suggestions for that. I happen to be in a family that I don't have those people in my family. I haven't had that kind of a conversation directly. It's a real challenge because it's hard to know what moves people. Part of what moves people is helping them understand personally what the impacts of things will be on their families or on themselves or on the businesses they're in. That's an important part of it. But it's hard to know where people get information now, and that's one of the challenges.
We have a question now from our own Dr. Mary Dinsmore, SES faculty. She asks, one of the reasons we are seeing issues today with water surrounds overuse and waste due to water being so cheap. However, water is a human right, so it must be priced so low to ensure all have accessibility to water. So how do we value something that is invaluable, or how do we ensure we have water without wasting?
Another great question. So I didn't say this when I talked about the Pope, but I'll say it now. I had a chance to meet Pope Francis at a conference at the Vatican Academy of Sciences. The Vatican has a remarkable Academy of Sciences. They didn't around Galileo, but they do now. And they organized a conference, and I helped organize it, on the human right to water. And in 2010, the United Nations declared a formal human right to water, the Human Rights Council. And one of the things they said was, water is an economic good and a human right. It's both of those things. How do we balance those things? And they didn't say, because water is a human right, water should be provided for free. What they said was, those of us who can afford to pay for water and the water services that we use ought to pay. And frankly, we probably should pay more than we're currently paying for those water services. But when water cannot be paid for, you cannot deprive someone of access to safe water and sanitation and hygiene because of poverty. That's this balance about human right to water and water as an economic good. It's both of those things, and we have mechanisms for ensuring that both of those things are satisfied.
Another question from the audience. You mentioned that good science makes good policy. How can scientists work more directly with policymakers to convey information and the urgency of climate change impacts?
So this gets to the question of conversation, about communications. Again, most scientists are not trained in communications, or they don't want to communicate. They do their work, they publish their papers in peer-reviewed journals. It makes them happy, they get tenure. They may not be working in a field that's directly political in any way. They may not be able or willing to communicate for whatever reason. But more and more scientists are beginning to communicate to policymakers. We testify in front of Congress. We write opinion pieces or letters to the editor, which all of you could write as well, opinion pieces and letters to the editor. And a little side note, write letters to the editor. Maybe nobody will read them, but newspapers, you'd be surprised at actually how often a good letter to the editor, a good letter will get published. And that's an important thing, especially for smaller newspapers around the country. Go to public hearings about water policy. Go to open houses for your congressional representatives, if they're having open houses anymore. So there are lots of ways that scientists and general members of the public can communicate about both science and about issues that they care about.
Another question asks, would you say that access or lack of access to recreational water, like beaches, lakes, creeks, etc., through social inequalities is considered water poverty?
Sure. I talked mostly about this big issue of failure to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone. An issue that, frankly, we know how to solve. We know how to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone. It's not a technological problem, and it's not an economic problem. It's an institutional failure on the part of governments. And it's true, and I didn't say this either, in the United States as well. Frontline communities, think about Flint, Michigan. Think about Jackson, Mississippi, for those of you familiar with those challenges, where safe water is not available to mostly communities of color and frontline communities, and Native American communities that have never had access in the United States to safe water and sanitation. Water poverty is a problem here as well, but it could also be defined as access to the other benefits that we get from our water systems, to healthy ecosystems, to access to beaches and recreational access to water resources. It's a broad problem, and again, it's not a problem we don't know how to solve. We do know how to solve those problems, and we could be much more aggressive at addressing them.
Great, thanks, and they keep coming. So the next question would be, with rampant urbanization, how can we get water to those areas without compromising the environment where it comes from? A good reference would be the Los Angeles Aqueduct. I think it says Hetchy Aqueduct, etc.
Dean Tuckman mentioned that I wrote a book last year called The 3 Ages of Water. It's basically the human history of water, from literally the Big Bang and the formation of hydrogen and oxygen in the universe and the formation of our solar system and where our water came from, through the second age of water, which is our age, when we sort of figured out scientifically and technologically and economically how to manage water resources, to the third age, which is my vision for a positive, sustainable future, which I think is possible. And I've already forgotten the question with that segue.
It's tucked away in my back pocket in a pile, but it was also just safe ways of getting the water without compromising.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so in the second age of water, the idea was populations are growing and our economies are growing. Demand for water would grow. That was always the assumption from planners and water managers and so on. It's how I was trained. And so in order to do that, especially for big cities that long ago outgrew their local water resources because of huge populations, we figured out how to move water from one place to another. We built big dams so we could store water when we got it and move it to where we wanted it. And California, where I live, is like that. We have big dams that store water in the rainy season so that we can use it in the dry season, and aqueducts to move it from Northern California and the mountains down to LA where we need it, where it's very dry. Those advances of the second age of water brought great benefits to us, but also some unexpected consequences, including in particular impacts on the ecosystems and the environment. The more water you take out of natural ecosystems for growing cities, or especially for agriculture, since 80% of the water humans use goes to agriculture, the greater the impacts on ecosystems. And so part of the third age of water that I talk about is how do we continue to do the things that we want We want our cities to be healthy. We want to have clean water for everyone. We want to be able to grow food for everyone. We want clean clothes and clean dishes. How do we do that without destroying the ecosystems that also depend on those water resources? And the third age of water, I think we can figure that out, and we're starting to figure that out by growing more food with less water, by improving irrigation efficiency and changing crop patterns and diets, which I mentioned briefly. Your washing machines and your dishwashers and your toilets today are far more water efficient than they were 20 years ago because of federal regulations at the EPA. Look up the water sense programs. We're doing more with the water we already have. We're taking down big dams, damaging dams, and restoring ecosystem flows. So we can satisfy our urban demands, we can satisfy our agricultural demands, which we have to do, but in a different way than we've been doing them. And that's the challenge of the third age, to figure out what's working to meet the new realities of sustainability generally, and to do those things faster and more widely.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go off script and ask my own question, if that's okay. This one, I think from being here in Chicago and at Loyola, it's easier to see, and I teach environmental science here, it's easy to see biases, maybe mistaken views from the politically right-leaning perspective. Maybe in a humble kind of self-critiquing way, reflective way, have you in your vast experience noticed just any ways that we who lean politically left could also, maybe little traps we can fall into in our thinking when it comes to climate change or specifically water?
Sure. So that's actually an important question. Abuse of science isn't only a right-wing thing. There's misuse of science, there's abuse of science anywhere for ideological reasons, for whatever reasons that might occur. I've seen lots of conversations about climate change that are more extreme than the science suggests, about human extinction in the next 10 years, about the loss of the Arctic tomorrow, about misunderstandings or misrepresentations of science on all sides. So that's an important question. I appreciate it because of the opportunity for me to clarify that. Look for it everywhere. It happens to be particularly extreme right now on the right. But it's not unique to the right.
Thanks for that. Next question from the audience is, how do we respond to the tension between technological advancement and water usage, i.e. the water footprint of generative AI, for example? Is there a way to use those resources ethically?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of new challenges associated with water. I mean, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, AI would not have been on my list. But it turns out that many of the artificial intelligence, I hate that term since it's artificial, but it's not intelligent. But many of the AI systems are very water intensive because of their use of data centers and calculations that they do. And so there's been a growing discussion about data centers and their use of energy and their use of water. I think that's hopefully a temporary problem, in the sense that as we have a better understanding of what they are, we'll build them differently, we'll use different kinds of cooling systems, we won't put them in places that are hot and dry. There are ways to get around that, but it was a reminder that we can never take for granted that the problems that we have today are the only problems we're going to have to deal with. There are always new things happening. There are always new challenges coming down the road. And that's one of the reasons why I said in my talk that there's plenty of good science that still has to be done around water resources and around climate change and around energy. And we have to be careful not to make things worse by doing things that we don't fully understand.
We do have one more from the online audience. Someone who noted that the fossil fuel industry created a sort of green veneer, and what can be done to limit their environmental impact when there are not in fact the type of regulations that there might have been in the past?
Well, policy, as I mentioned, can be economic strategies, it can be regulatory strategies, it can be communications and public opinion strategies. There are lots of things that change the way people behave, or that change the way corporations behave. If the current administration is very anti-regulation and anti-federal action, we're going to have to think about alternative strategies. We're going to have to think about individual pressure on corporations. We're going to have to think about state strategies. We're going to have to think about legal strategies. There are lots of things that we can do. One comment about corporations. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we're the science secretariat for something called the UN CEO Water Mandate, which is the work of the UN to try and work with corporations around the issue of sustainability. And that work at the UN is quite broad-based. It's energy, it's ecosystems, it's water. We're working with them on the water side. There are every corporation uses water. Sometimes water's their main business, but sometimes it's just involved in making the goods and services that they produce. And so there are many corporations now who are trying to understand their water footprints and their water impacts in the communities they work. And the good corporations, and there are good corporations, understand that there's a risk if they don't do that right. There's a risk to their reputations. There's a risk to their markets. The classic example is a number of years ago now, Coca-Cola got into a big fight in India, a bottling plant in India, because the local community was sure that the Coca-Cola plant was using their water resources that the community wasn't getting. And the community objected and protested and shut that bottled water plant down. And that woke up Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola now has a reasonably good stewardship program to try and understand the impact of their operations, to try and work not necessarily toward carbon neutrality, but water neutrality, so that the water they use is made up in some way in local communities, to try and restore ecosystems. Corporations have a role to play here, and the idea here is work with the good ones, shame the bad ones, and make it a part of the strategy. If the federal government's not helpful, if regulations are weaker, there are plenty of other avenues for us to act.
What do you have to say about the possibility of water wars? Is it a tipping point?
These are all great questions. And I could talk all night, so you're just going to have to tell me when you want me to shut up. One of the things that I do especially at the Pacific Institute is I run our water and conflict program. We look at historical conflicts over water. If you're interested in this, Google something called the Water Conflict Chronology. It's the largest open source database worldwide on violence associated with water resources, and it goes back 4,500 years to the very first water wars that we know about in ancient Mesopotamia between two city-states in Sumeria over irrigation canals. And that water war, the history of that's literally carved in stone. That's how we know about it. Up until the present day. And we look at conflicts over water as a trigger of conflict, fights over access and control of water resources, water as a weapon used during conflicts that start for other reasons, where dams are attacked or water systems are attacked, and water is a casualty of conflict. Water is a weapon, water is a trigger, water is a casualty of conflict. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnieper River in the Ukraine in 2023, the largest dam in Europe, destroyed by the Russians, was an example of water as a casualty of conflict. Attacks on civilian infrastructure in Gaza and the West Bank is an attack on water systems, and I would note a violation of international law. If you look at the data, there is a growing trend toward the number of events of conflicts over water over time in the last few years. There's been an increase in the database in the number of events over time. A lot of them are subnational conflicts between cities and farms over access to water, in the Sahel between farmers and pastoralists, droughts during riots in India and Iran during droughts, again, between rural and urban. users, but also some international conflicts over shared watersheds where water crosses a border. So water and conflict is a big issue, and there's a climate component to this again. As water flows are affected, as water availability is affected, as demand for water is affected, we see a connection between climate change and water resources and conflict.
You talked about aggression in policy. Do you suggest that in the realm of policy we should adopt more aggressive models? If so, what would that look like? And can you give an action-based example?
More aggressive models?
Aggressive policies, models, yeah.
So I'm not going to talk about policies in particular. Again, there's so many options, there's so many avenues from a policy point of view. I'm able to speak out. I have no federal funding. I actually have no funding at all. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute, and I'm not paid. And so I have the ability to speak out where other people don't. But that's, again, an individual thing. In terms of models, maybe I'll leave it at that.
I've got one from our online viewers again. How can we continue scientific progress without compromising climate justice and water security? Can we achieve all three?
I think we can. I think we have no choice but to achieve all three. Climate science is going to continue. The US has been the center of that for decades. The best climate models in the world originated here at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab at Princeton. They just cut major science. The National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, just lost half its funding. The Goddard Space Institute for Space Studies, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York, funded by NASA, just lost all of its funding. But there are now very smart, sophisticated climate models around the world. So we may lose our preeminence in this, but the rest of the world's going to continue doing climate science. And that's going to continue. We'll do what we can here with the resources that we have, and hopefully this will be a short-term, short-lived blip in the scientific integrity and strength of the country.
Based on your expertise, when in the world do you think we will face the next possible day zero?
So day zero, for those of you not familiar with it, was a phrase coined originally for Cape Town, South Africa, during a very severe drought. A big city in South Africa, one of the biggest, very scarce water resources, very severe drought, a drought that climate scientists said was influenced, not caused, but worsened by climate change because of rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns. And they called it day zero because it was the estimate for when the city's water supply would literally run out, when the reservoirs would run out, when there would be no more water for the city's urban water delivery system. And they called it day zero, and we watched the reservoir levels drop, and they kept waiting for the rains to start, and they implemented very strong conservation and efficiency programs to try and extend the water resources that they already had in the hopes that the rainy season would bail them out. And the rainy season bailed them out just barely. They avoided day zero. And since then, Sao Paulo, down in South America, a number of big cities have had their own brushes with day zero. And so when I talked about one of the things we have to do is to build resilience to our water systems, that's partly what I was referring to. As climate change gets worse, as populations grow, as demands for water grow, even without climate change, our urban systems are going to be increasingly stressed. And with climate change on top of that, those stresses are going to get worse. So to build resilience, you want to do things to prepare. So water planners, it's not like droughts are new. Every water system in the world is built with the idea that there will be periods of time that are dry and periods of time that are wet. But almost all of those plans were based on yesterday's climate, not tomorrow's climate. And so one of the things we have to do is our planners have to get better at integrating climate science into water planning and management. Looking at climate models, running different kinds of scenarios about droughts, longer droughts, more extreme droughts. And some water systems are starting to do that. And when they do that, they start to also think about resilience. They start to think about, all right, we need more efficient water systems. We need strategies to help people understand how to reduce their water use and still do the things they want to do. We have to think about alternative sources of supply. So in California, for example, like most places, like Chicago, like everywhere around, we collect a tremendous amount of our wastewater. By law, federal law, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, we treat that water often to a very, very high standard, and then typically we throw it away. California, we dump it in the ocean. We can treat that water to any standard we want, including drinking water standard or beyond, with technology that we already have, and we can reuse it. And that doesn't require taking more water out of overtapped groundwater. It doesn't require drawing down another river. It doesn't require building another reservoir and killing another stream somewhere else. Recycled and reused wastewater is a pretty reliable source of water because we generate a lot of wastewater. It's pretty drought-proof, and it's usable for anything we want, up to and including drinking water. We don't have to use it for drinking water, but we can use it for all sorts of things. California today recycles and reuses 18% of its wastewater, and we're planning on tripling that. Singapore recycles and reuses 98% of its wastewater, and some of that recycled wastewater is so pure, they use it for their chip manufacturing, which requires ultra-pure water. Israel recycles and reuses 90% of its wastewater, mostly for agriculture. We know how to do this, and it's an alternative source of supply, another way to reduce vulnerability and build resilience of our water systems. Sorry, long answer.
Great, thank you. And we're just about at time, so we have two last questions that I'm going to kind of combine as a two-parter. So the first one is about encouragement. As someone who is experienced in the science world, what words of encouragement do you have for young scientists today? I graduate in May and I am scared. Frowning face. The second one says, what gives you hope in the face of severe challenges the world is facing due to climate change? So words of encouragement, especially for young people, and what gives you hope?
So science is a wonderful field. I chose water and climate. As I said at the beginning, it's connected to everything we care about. So you can work on anything and still address some of these broader issues, whether you're interested in history or economics or policy or politics or engineering. Again, there are avenues for you to contribute in any way possible. I have to admit, I'm glad I'm not graduating right now. It's a scary time. But having said that, there are opportunities at the local level and at the state level and internationally. So there's still lots of opportunities. And I think just get involved, learn how to learn. That's really what education is all about. It's not about individual facts or individual things, but it's about learning how to learn and learning how to do different things. And what gives me hope, and again, the third title, I talk about the 3 ages of water in my book. The third age is a hope for the future. I believe that a sustainable future for water is possible. In fact, I think it's inevitable. I think it's going to happen. Now, that's not to minimize the difficulty of getting there or the bad things that are going to happen on the way there if we don't move more aggressively. But everywhere I look in the water space, I see success stories. And I've talked about some of those things, about the ability to grow more food with less water, conservation and efficiency programs, about the growing understanding of environmental justice and equity issues around water, about the understanding that we know how to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone on the planet. And we've set a target to do so. The Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is to do that. And we're not going to meet the 2030 target, I'm afraid, but we could, and we will eventually. There are success stories everywhere in the water world, and the challenge is to understand them, to make them better understood, to make them more likely to be adopted by policymakers who may simply understand what they did 20 years ago, rather than what they ought to be doing today, and to scale those things up. If we do that, a positive future is inevitable. Thank you.
I'm going to use this one. Thank you, Peter. That was really helpful. It was a great synopsis. I think you did give us hope after an incredibly depressing few sets of slides there. You came around and showed us that there is a way forward. We can do it. We have the technology already, and we are doing it in many places. So thank you for that. I just want to invite all of you that are participating to join us tomorrow in this same location. We will have 3 different panels that are promising to be as exciting as tonight's keynote was. We have lots of speakers that are going to come from lots of different perspectives to talk to us about climate change. And okay, you guys are doing the slides, thank you. We're going to be talking about water in both international and in the Great Lakes, and then the third panel will be what solutions are we using here in the Chicago region. So I think, you shouldn't miss that. I think that's going to be fun. And also tomorrow afternoon, we will have a poster session, which will feature many of the students that are here, as well as faculty, and the work that they're doing around the environment, climate change, and water. I don't want you to miss that either. And then we will have an exhibitors hall. So there are a lot of organizations in the region that are working on these issues and really making solutions come to life. And I want you to meet them all and see what they're doing, and you might even find ways that you could get involved with them. So please join us tomorrow. And now if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, I just want to thank people who have made this conference a reality. First, I would like to thank our corporate sponsors, Green Signs, Solomon, Cordwell, and Bentz, and Beans and Bagels. All 3 of them donated generous financial gifts to help us run this conference, and I thank them. And as I mentioned earlier, Tradewater is another B Corp in the area who donated carbon credits to make this a carbon neutral conference. So thank you all for your support. And in addition, there are 8 Loyola partners that I would like to acknowledge. They supported the conference both financially and also programmatically. Our lead partner is the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund, who sponsors the Ann F. Baum Speaker Series in the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership. Thank you. And then we have several other internal Loyola partners, including the Department of Fine and Performing Arts, who you got to see a little taste of earlier today, the Center for Urban Research and Learning, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Hanks Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the School of Communication, university libraries, and university marketing and communications. We're ever grateful for all of our sponsors and partners. I would also like to take this opportunity to give a special thanks to SES staff members Stephanie Folk and Margaret Helwich, who led the conference planning and implementation committees these last several months. Thank you to you both. And they had a lot of help from several SES faculty and staff who put in many hours of their time on the conference planning and execution. And alphabetically, they're listed Laura Brentner, Mary Dinsmore, Kara Duskevitz, Kevin Erickson, Debjani Gatak, Ruben Keller, Rachel Lehman, Mark Mackey, and Jackie Nowotnik. Also Karen Schauwaker and Zach Wakeman. I thank you all and the entire SES conference team for doing such a great job and making this conference a great success. Thank you. And now I invite everybody to join us at a reception that we'll have right outside the hallway there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you tomorrow.